This reflection is upon the readings for the Ascension of Jesus. The first reading comes from Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, verses 1 to 11, and it's the introduction to the book. Now, like the Gospel of Luke, this book is dedicated to Theophilus. We don't know if Theophilus is a Roman authority. Very often throughout Luke's writings, he speaks about Roman authorities to curry favor with them. It might be the name of a rich patron who is paying for the copying of these two books, or most probably it's a symbolic name. Theos means God, phileo, lover. Who are the lovers of God? Christians. So these two books, the Gospel and Acts of the Apostles, both written by Luke, are dedicated to us. And this book, the Acts of the Apostles, speaks about the ministry of Jesus after the Ascension. That is, after he's gone to heaven, and when the disciples and the apostles are fulfilling that ministry in what they do and what they preach. Well, in this passage, we hear about the Ascension, that Jesus is taken up into heaven, body and soul. He disappears upon the clouds. Now, that's a subtle reference to Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, we hear the Son of Man would descend upon the clouds. So it would only be logical that when he's going back to heaven, he ascends upon the clouds. Theological question: did he have to do it that way? Couldn't he have just disappeared from their midst and been with the Father? And the answer is, of course he could have. But the apostles were not always the brightest people in the world. And so he wanted to do it in a symbolic way so they would understand fully what was going on, that he was ascending to the throne. And then we have two men who explain what happened to the disciples who have been watching Jesus ascend and looking at the heavens. Remember how in the Gospel of Luke, at the resurrection scene, there were two men in the tomb. Obviously, these are the same two men, two angels, but they remind the apostles that this is what had to happen. Jesus had to go to the Father. The second reading, there are two choices, both from Ephesians. And the first one really centers on the idea that Jesus ascended to the heavens because he first descended to the lower parts of the world. Now, some people will say they're talking about Jesus' descent into the underworld, but it doesn't seem to be the case. That appears in the first letter of Peter. It's not that in this case. In this case, it's simply that he descended to our human condition. Remember, Philippians says he took the form of a slave, and he even died on a cross. So he descended to the most profound expression of what it means to be human. Our fallibility, our brokenness, even our death. He took that all upon himself, and then he ascended. And likewise, the second choice, again from Ephesians 4, speaks about the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, sits at the right hand of the Father. And in this case, the emphasis of the author is really, if that's all true, then we should be living in Christ's love, expressing it. We do that by being patient with each other, loving, forgiving, but also by recognizing that God has given us certain gifts. Some are apostles, some are teachers, some are prophets. We should embrace those gifts and use them for the good of the community. The gospel is from Mark 16, 15 to 20. Now, the Gospel of Mark actually has two endings. The first ending is verse 1 to 8 of chapter 16, in which the women go to the tomb, hear about the resurrection, don't see Jesus, and then don't say anything to anyone because they're afraid. Well, for obvious reasons, a scribe later on found that ending inappropriate. It didn't say enough. So what the scribe seems to have done is added verses 9 to 20, which are an amalgam of the resurrection stories in the other Gospels. This is not the same vocabulary, not the same theology, not the same grammar as the rest of the Gospel of Mark. Having said that, though, this is still part of the Gospel, still inspired. In fact, these words are found in the other Gospels. What do we hear in this passage? That the disciples will go out, They will perform many signs. They'll have the gift of tongues. They will not be harmed even if they're bitten by poisonous serpents. Remember how St. Paul picks up the poisonous serpent on the island of Malta after he's shipwrecked, and he's not harmed by it. And that the disciples are to go throughout the whole world preaching the good news. And so the gospel that we hear today is sort of the mandate that Jesus gave the disciples before he ascended into heaven.